It was the afternoon of Halloween in 1973. Gerald Ford was President of the United States. The Vietnam War was winding down, and all was right with the world. A knock came at the front door. My mother opened the door and called me to the door, and there stood my two friends, boys who lived in my neighborhood, Eddie and Scotty. They were both a year older than me, and they were in full drag. My friends were a year older than my 10 years then. They had decided earlier that they were too old to trick or treat, and so I decided I wasn't going to go without them. Now they stood there in women's clothes. Scotty was dressed in a long white wig, white plastic mini dress, and white knee-high go-go boots. It was quite an outfit even for a woman, but let alone for a boy. Eddie was wearing his mother's clothes, and they were not very memorable by comparison. They told me that they changed their minds and wanted to go out for candy this evening. Did I want to go? After agreeing that I did and that I would be ready in 30 minutes, my mother and I went into her room. The only clothes that would fit would be the outfit she had worn on her honeymoon in 1960. So we put on the outfit, applied some makeup, put on brown pups, and I waited as she left the room. There was something like a phone call or something like that. I looked into the mirror and I was astonished. I stood there with a Dutch boy cut, dark brown wig, a brown pillbox hat, brown shift, and matching jacket, and pencil skirt. I looked to the mirror shocked at what I saw. The thought that went through my mind was, "You look really good." And I did. With appropriate padding and my big brown eyes, dark brown hair on the wig. I had dark brown hair at the time, but the wig added more. I bore a striking resemblance to Natalie Wood, circa 1960. And that's pretty good, that's pretty good. A couple of weeks before that event, my classmate Margaret had told me that I would look better as a girl than as a boy. I was annoyed with Margaret at that remark, and I remembered it because it hit someplace. I wanted to be more masculine, as boys at 10 might want to be. Standing there on Halloween, I had to concede, Margaret was right. I would be the most attractive person trick-or-treating that night in my neighborhood. I knew that. That was my only gender-bending experience. And the next day I had no inclination to don women's clothes, ever again. The makeup was icky. Forget about running upstairs to someone's front door while in heels and a pencil skirt. I wish that I had on my pants and tennis shoes. Had I been transgender, though, that experience might have been either a revelation or a confirmation of my identity. I am cisgender. I identify with the gender assigned to me at birth. For someone who identifies as transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid, that moment might have been freeing, opening a door to an identity that was hidden in the recesses of the mind and never lived. It was 1973, and the words to describe these identities had not become current yet. People who identified as transgender then just did not have the words or the community in which to live as they wanted to be. It would have been too dangerous. What does transgender mean? A transgender person, according to the UA's website, often abbreviated to trans person, is someone whose gender identity or gender expression does not correspond with the sex they were assigned at birth. This does not only mean that someone who is assigned the male gender at birth now identifies as female. It is much more complicated than that. There are a staggering number of ways to define oneself in reference to gender identity. I cannot begin to describe the myriad of gender identities and expressions that exist. We don't have time enough today to name them all. Besides, there are conflicting definitions for a lot of the terms. Even groups of people who identify with a term describing their own gender identity might not completely agree with every definition. In public perception, there is some confusion about transgender people and drag queens, drag kings, and cross-dressing. As it happens, transgender people, people who are cross-dressers, drag queens, and drag kings do follow under the umbrella of transgender. States are banning drag queens reading books to children in schools and libraries. States are also banning children from attending drag shows. For many people, drag queens and cross-dressers are the same thing as transgender people entirely. They put those into the same categories, but they are not all the same. Cross-dressers are people who dress in clothes opposite from the gender they were assigned at birth. They might or might not identify with that gender. In other words, men who are cross-dressers might identify as male and heterosexual. It has traditionally been estimated that most of the men who cross-dress identify as male and heterosexual. I think we've all seen Woody Allen's movie, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex, but we're afraid to ask. And there's a scene where a man who is someone who identifies as heterosexual and male goes into a closet and dresses up a little bit. Drag is different. Drag queens and drag kings are performers who offer exaggerated performative presentations of gender and often cross-dress performatively. Neither cross-dressing nor drag indicate one's sexual identity or orientation. Drag kings are women who dress up as men. Being transgender is still within this category, but it can also mean other different things. Being transgender means not identifying with the gender identity, or being transsexual means not identifying, or other definite definitions, means not identifying with the gender identity that was assigned at birth. It is something deeper than just donning clothes. If someone who was assigned male identity at birth and is transgender and wearing clothes, it can also mean wearing female clothes or other features traditionally assigned to women, then that person is only making that person's gender identity more public. Being who that person feels is a true expression of inner identity. Cross-dressers and drag queens do not usually express a profound sense of self in the same way. Some transgender people may or may not be transsexual. Transsexuals are individuals who have medically and legally changed their sex or who wish to do so. Most transsexual people feel a conflict between their gender identity and the sex they were assigned at birth. These are the transgender people who are being persecuted. These are the people who some feel threatened by. These are the people who are being threatened. These are the people who are identifying as male at birth, who wish to become medically and legally female, and people who are identified as female at birth, who wish to become medically and legally male. We grew up in a society that enforced gender roles. In the book of Genesis, it is written, male and female, he created them. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, that was the presumption about gender. Everyone was male or female, and those who, like Christine Jurgensen, that's a blast from the past for some of us, changed their gender, and they were treated as an aberration. Even then, though, biology was not really supportive of the claim that everyone is male or female. My colleague, the Reverend Charles Stevens, writes about this in a sermon entitled Transgender 101. He writes, when it comes down to biological sex, there are attributes of anatomy, chromosomes and hormones that help shape a person's biological sex to be male, female, or intersex. Intersex people are people who are somewhere in between, biologically. I listened to a webinar led by the UUA's Alex Capitan, who heads our LGBTQ and multicultural programs. Alex pointed out that we don't all comfortably fit into the boxes male or female. There are, for example, 1 out of every 100 people in the United States whose bodies do not fit the male or female definition because there may be factors from chromosomes, hormones, or actual attributes of anatomy that don't fit neatly into one category or another. And there is 1 person out of every 1,500 people in the United States who have ambiguous genitalia, neither completely male nor female. Okay, but that's not a lot of people, is it? Well, if we take that figure, there are more people in the United States who fit into the category of intersex than the total numbers of Unitarian Universalists. That's kind of surprising. Here is where it is important to stress that sex refers to biology, whereas gender refers to that which is cultural and social. Thus, our understanding of gender issues are layered over the actual biological sex of a person. And transgender identity is even more complicated. Some people fall into the transgender label and have different understandings of gender identity. Being non-binary means not conforming to either or in terms of gender identity. Some identify as transgender, some do not. Being gender fluid means that one feels male or female under different circumstances. And it goes on. We do not have the time today to consider all the types of transgender identity. Are you confused yet? Yeah. Good. You've been listening. The world of transgender identity is confusing, sometimes even to persons who identify as transgender. And it's in flux. It's so new, there's no official dictionary of giving us a definition of these kinds of things. And even the ones that you find in standard dictionaries are not really necessarily reflective of what people experience or how they define themselves. And I will not venture into the world of pronouns. Pronoun used for transgender persons is confusing and can be all over the spectrum. Some people use made-up pronouns or different kinds of pronouns to describe themselves. I can't remember people's names. To remember all these variations of pronouns is probably going to be beyond me in this lifetime. This is a welcoming congregation. A welcoming congregation to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. I always hate to use that word. If you're a person of a certain generation, that was a slur. And it's difficult for some of us to use it because we identify it with something we don't want to say, the way we don't want to describe people, because that was, in our youth, a derogatory way to refer to people who are gay or lesbian. When this congregation became a welcoming congregation, It stated that it would welcome lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons into its membership and advocate publicly for LGBT equality in society at large. Advocacy means talking about issues and taking action. And action is needed. I don't need to tell you that transgender lives are threatened, not just by violence, but also by the reality that transgender people go through quite a lot of pain internally and not fitting into the world as it defines them. And working for transgender rights, you realize that being open about things is a matter of life and death for some people. Today, transgender people are being attacked by state governments in the majority of states in this nation. Laws have been enacted depriving transgender people of medical aid to assist their transitions, making it possible for medical personnel not to treat transgender people, prohibiting the use of public facilities except for the ones of the gender assigned to them at birth. It is now against the law for children to attend drag shows in many states. Some states restrict government documents to the gender assigned at birth. The American Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking 491 anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States. Most of these are aimed at transgender persons. A bill before the Pennsylvania House would prohibit the discussion of sexual orientation and gender from kindergarten to 5th grade. This is basically impossible as children are growing up, for example, with two mommies or an uncle who used to be an aunt. Not talking about this reality creates a level of shame about families that exist now in favor of stereotypes of families that existed in the past. By not being able to speak about sexual orientation and gender identity in a way that a child would understand, public schools would be sending the message that these topics must be left unspoken. You are not supposed to talk about your life when you go to school, or the people you know when you go to school. This opens the possibility of confusion in the mind of a child, confusion that might have negative repercussions. Being transgender is not about sexuality. It's about how one perceives oneself. When I looked in the mirror 49 years ago, I knew, regardless of my outward appearance at that moment, that I was male. And that wasn't a problem for me. For some children, younger than even my 11 years, on that Halloween's Eve, that situation would have been more complicated. Gender identity is probably formed at a young age, even if it's not a spoken or the person is not able to verbalize it or even understand it. Someone who is transgender is already dealing with confusion as a child. Most transgender people do. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Standard Manual, and Statistical Manual, thank you. I went through 4 years of training as a counselor, and I still get that one confused. It's the American Psychiatric Association's Manual of Disorders. It catalogs mental disorders with diagnostic criteria. Among mental disorders is gender dysphoria, which is defined as a condition of marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender. This condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, school, or other important areas of functioning. That was a direct quote from the DSM's description of the disorder for pre-adolescent children. Not talking about gender identity with pre-adolescent children may lead to mental health issues for children who might be transgender. Banning discussion of gender identity might be harmful for some children, in other words. For the rest of the children, they learn that some people are different, and that's okay, because we've talked about it. Children will pick up in other places or in other ways. A few months ago, my 5-year-old told me that he believed that God is a woman on the inside and a man on the outside. No, I'm sorry, I reversed that. He said it was a woman on the outside and a man on the inside. I paused for a moment silently. The thought went through my mind, God is a drag queen. I told my child, that's as good a description of God as any other. Children are now being brought up in a time when notions of gender are not fixed. It is unlikely that when most of us were children, that we would have been corrected by our parents at such a statement that my son made. We were not able to express openly any ambiguity about God's gender. Some children now are growing up in families in which it is acceptable to speculate about the nature of God and are not discouraged from spiritual imagination. At least we try to do that as Unitarian Universalist parents. This is certainly not accepted everywhere, though. In this country, anytime something new is presented, it creates a reaction, often an hysterical reaction. Now, the reaction is to transgender people. They are a small percentage of the population, yet the interest that they are generating from reactionary forces is out of proportion to any influence they may have in numbers. This is the same kind of reaction that people had to lesbian and gay rights and marriage equality in our not-so-recent past. Not so distant past, I'm sorry. In the 1980s and 1990s, legislatures, including the US Congress, passed legislation prejudicial to lesbians and gays throughout this nation. At that time, public opinion supported these kinds of discriminatory laws. But slowly, lesbians and gay men came out of the closet, and people began to understand that they were their family member or friend. Heterosexuals danced to music sung by openly gay artists. They realized that all that was being asked by gay and lesbian people was to be treated like everyone else, to be treated with the assumption that they also had inherent worth and dignity. So why are we going through this same kind of hysteria over transgender people again? Maybe it's because it's another wedge issue that can divide people. What does it really matter if someone was assigned a gender at birth, but discovers another gender identity as that person develops? If you are in that category and you're a child, you're going to figure it out sooner or later, and it's not when you leave your parents, you will possibly try to live your truth. Who does this harm? Will it cause a collapse of civil society? 30 years ago, most people in this country felt that marriage between adults of the same gender would lead to terrible consequences. Now Gallup polling suggests that 71% of Americans support marriage equality. Why did we have to go through 30 years of division? It benefited politicians allied with religious fanatics then, and transgender issues provide the same kind of energy. There are a lot more significant issues to be debated. Causes like racial justice, global warming, healthcare, and labor should be at the forefront of our national conversation. Instead, Americans are being riled up over something that should not be an issue. Transgender oppression will not be an issue 30 years from now, but we will still have problems with rising oceans and erratic weather patterns, racism, and poverty. The hysteria around transgender people in our national discourse is a distraction from deeper issues that call for economic and social change on a grand scale. Society is changing, and those who are young now will one day reverse the actions that are being taken today. One day, children will grow up in places so open that when a boy says, "I feel more like a girl," the people who love that child will listen, and there will be a place for that child. Someday there will be a place for everyone, and as the book of Micah says, none shall make them afraid. It is totally apparent that this will not happen in my lifetime. The work of our lives is not for ourselves alone, but for the people who are to follow us, that they might find a better place than we have ever known. May they not remember us too much as they go about their lives. May they only feel greater freedom and possibility than we have experienced. Today we have explored, in a very small measure, what it means to be transgender. Hopefully we have all learned something or been stimulated to new perceptions or the calling of the Spirit. The way of Unitarian Universalism is to examine many different religious perspectives, to support one another in spiritual growth, to respect diversity among humanity and in the natural world, and to act in ways that reflect the path that this way of being calls us. On this day, the first Sunday in Gay Pride Month, let us think upon these things and think deeply. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.